There are moments in life when you begin to rise, and suddenly, everything around you shifts. Conversations change. Familiar voices grow quiet. The same people who once celebrated your potential start questioning your confidence. Not because you became arrogant, but because something in you stopped shrinking. You didn't become louder, you became clearer. And clarity unsettles those who are comfortable with smallness. If you are listening to this and feel a quiet strength forming within you, understand this: you are not rising by accident. You are not outgrowing people because you think you are better. You are rising because God is faithful to finish what He begins. And when God builds something, it carries weight, purpose, and authority. Rising in His design is not pride, it is alignment. Some of you were taught to confuse humility with hiding. You learned to apologize for your gifts, to downplay your convictions, to soften your obedience so others would feel comfortable around you. But the Bible never teaches God's chosen people to live small lives to protect fragile opinions. Scripture shows us men and women who stood firm even when it cost them approval, comfort, and safety. They did not rise to dominate others. They rose because obedience demanded it. There is a tension you feel when God begins to elevate you internally before anything changes externally. You sense growth, calling, and direction, yet resistance increases instead of easing. This is not punishment. It is confirmation. Darkness does not argue with what poses no threat. Resistance reveals relevance. Pressure reveals purpose. God often allows friction not to stop you, but to strengthen your resolve. You are not designed to carry shame for stepping into what God ordained. You are built with intention. Your temperament, your experiences, your struggles, and even your delays were woven together with divine precision. Nothing about your life is random. The timing of your awakening is not late. The intensity of your calling is not excessive. The discomfort you feel is not a sign to retreat. It is a signal that transformation is underway. Do not apologize for becoming who God is shaping you to be. The same hands that formed you knew the weight you would carry. The same voice that called you forward knew the resistance you would face. And the same God who placed you in this generation, in this moment, did not miscalculate your capacity. You are rising because heaven designed you for this life, not a smaller one. Number 1. Chosen does not mean comfortable. When God chooses someone, comfort is rarely part of the invitation. Being chosen is not an assurance of ease. It is an assignment that reshapes your life from the inside out. Scripture consistently shows that God's selection often pulls people out of familiarity before it places them into fulfillment. The calling comes first, then the shaking. This is why so many who are chosen feel isolated long before they feel established. Look at the pattern in the Bible. Abraham was called to leave everything familiar before he ever saw the promise fulfilled. Moses was chosen, yet spent years misunderstood, first rejected by his own people, then hidden in the wilderness. David was anointed king, but instead of stepping into a throne, he stepped into caves, betrayal, and waiting. Being chosen did not remove hardship, it intensified it. Discomfort is often the evidence that God is doing something real. Comfort preserves what is, calling transforms what must change. When God chooses you, He begins to dismantle old dependencies, false identities, and misplaced security. He disrupts routines that would keep you small. He allows situations that force you to grow stronger, wiser, and more anchored in Him than in people's approval. This is why the chosen often feel out of place, even when nothing is visibly wrong. You sense that where you are can no longer contain who you are becoming. The discomfort is not ingratitude, it is discernment. God is preparing you for a level of responsibility that requires depth, not convenience, and depth is formed under pressure, not comfort. If your life feels uncomfortable right now, do not assume you missed God. Often it means you are right where His hand is most active. Chosen does not mean sheltered, it means shaped. Number 2. Why the chosen are often misunderstood. Misunderstanding is one of the quiet costs of being chosen. When God begins to elevate you internally, people rarely recognize what is happening in the spirit. They only see the outward shift, your boundaries, your clarity, your refusal to remain passive, and they interpret it through their own limitations. What they cannot control, they question. What they cannot explain, they resist. Joseph's dreams were misunderstood as arrogance. David's courage was mistaken for recklessness. Jeremiah's obedience was labeled rebellion. Even Jesus was accused of having the wrong spirit while operating in perfect alignment with the Father. Being misunderstood does not mean you are wrong. Often it means you are ahead of what others are prepared to recognize. Light exposes what darkness prefers to keep hidden. When God's calling begins to surface in your life, it confronts insecurities, fears, and unhealed wounds in others. Some will celebrate you. Others will quietly hope you stop growing. This reaction is not about you. It is about what your obedience awakens in them. The danger is allowing misunderstanding to reshape your identity. Many chosen people start editing themselves to be more palatable. They soften conviction, delay obedience, or suppress growth to avoid tension. But Scripture never instructs the chosen to live by consensus. God calls His people to faithfulness, not popularity. You must learn to stand steady when your motives are questioned and your intentions are misread. God sees what people cannot. He understands the cost of your obedience, the prayers behind your decisions, and the battles no one applauded. Misunderstanding is not a sign to retreat. It is often a sign that God is advancing you beyond familiar perception. Being chosen means being willing to be known by God even when misunderstood by people. Number 3. Stop apologizing for obedience. There comes a moment in the life of the chosen when obedience begins to cost more than silence. At that point, many people feel the pressure to explain themselves, to soften their convictions, or to apologize for the direction God has clearly set before them. But obedience to God was never meant to come with an apology to people who are uncomfortable with it. The Bible does not present obedience as arrogance, yet it also does not portray it as timid. When God speaks, He expects movement, not negotiation. Abraham did not apologize for leaving. Noah did not ask permission to build. Daniel did not compromise his devotion to preserve comfort. They obeyed, not because it was easy, but because it was right. False humility often disguises itself as wisdom. It tells you to wait when God has said move. It tells you to be quiet when God has said stand. It convinces you that shrinking is safer than obedience. But obedience that is delayed out of fear is still disobedience. God does not call His people to manage perceptions. He calls them to follow His voice. Even Jesus refused to dilute His mission to gain approval. He walked in compassion, but He did not bend truth to avoid conflict. When the Father's will was clear, He moved forward, even when misunderstanding, rejection, and sacrifice followed. If the Son of God did not apologize for obedience, neither should those who follow Him. When you stop apologizing for obedience, you step into spiritual authority. Not authority over others, but authority over fear, doubt, and the need for validation. Obedience anchors you in God's approval, freeing you from the exhausting cycle of people-pleasing. You are not called to be agreeable. You are called to be faithful. Number 4. God builds before He reveals. God is never in a hurry to reveal what He has not yet finished building. While people often want visibility, God prioritizes depth. He strengthens character before He grants influence. He refines motives before He releases responsibility. This is why so many chosen individuals experience long seasons of obscurity before stepping into what God promised. Moses spent decades in the wilderness before leading a nation. David learned to shepherd sheep before shepherding people. Jesus lived in quiet obedience for 30 years before beginning His public ministry. These were not wasted years. They were foundational years. God was building patience, humility, endurance, and discernment, qualities that visibility would later demand. Hidden seasons are where dependence on God is formed. When applause is absent and recognition is limited, your motives are clarified. You learn whether you are pursuing calling or validation. God often keeps the chosen unseen until their identity is secure enough to withstand attention without being shaped by it. Revelation without preparation creates collapse. God's mercy is often seen in His delays. He withholds exposure not to punish you but to protect you. He knows what public responsibility requires, and He builds accordingly. What feels like stagnation is often stabilization. If you feel unseen, do not assume God has forgotten you. Building happens quietly. Strength forms slowly, and when God finally reveals what He has been shaping, it carries substance, stability, and authority that could not have been rushed. Number 5. Rising will cost you, but staying small costs more. Rising into what God has called you to be will cost you something. That truth cannot be softened. You may lose relationships that were built on familiarity rather than alignment. You may outgrow environments that once felt safe. You may be misunderstood, questioned, or even opposed by people who benefited from you staying the same. But Scripture is clear. Obedience always has a cost, and disobedience has a higher one. Many people fear the price of rising because the loss feels immediate and personal. What they rarely consider is the long-term cost of remaining small. Staying where God has told you to move on from slowly drains your peace. Shrinking to maintain approval erodes your integrity. Compromise may feel like relief in the moment, but it creates a quiet unrest that never leaves. Over time, the weight of unfulfilled purpose becomes heavier than the resistance you tried to avoid. The Bible shows us this contrast clearly. Esther risked her life by stepping into her calling, but silence would have cost an entire people. Peter lost his sense of safety when he followed Jesus, but denying that calling cost him peace and clarity. The rich young ruler chose comfort over obedience, and the cost was walking away from life itself. Rising is costly, but refusing to rise costs purpose, authority, and joy. God never hides the price of calling, but He also never exaggerates it. What you lose in the process is always temporary. What you gain is eternal alignment. When you rise in obedience, God replaces what falls away with clarity, strength, and peace that cannot be manufactured. You stop living divided between who God called you to be and who others expect you to remain. If something is being removed from your life as you rise, trust that God knows what you no longer need to carry forward. The cost of obedience refines you. The cost of staying small slowly diminishes you. Only one of those paths leads to life. Number 6. Chains break when identity is embraced. Spiritual bondage often survives on confusion. As long as you are unsure of who you are in God, old limitations maintain influence. Fear, guilt, shame, and insecurity lose their grip, not through struggle, but through revelation. When identity becomes clear, chains lose their authority. The Bible repeatedly connects freedom with identity. When Gideon saw himself as weak, he remained hidden. When God called him mighty, his fear began to loosen. When Peter understood he was forgiven and commissioned, the shame of his denial lost its power. When Paul realized he was chosen rather than condemned, his past could no longer define his future. Identity did what effort could not. Many chains are not external. They are internal agreements made in seasons of pain. Words spoken over you, experiences that wounded you, and failures that shaped your self-image become invisible restraints. God does not always break these chains by changing circumstances. Often He breaks them by revealing truth. When you see yourself the way God sees you, what once held you no longer fits. Embracing your God-given identity requires courage. It means releasing familiar limitations. It means walking forward without dragging old labels behind you. It means trusting that who God says you are is more accurate than what your past suggests. Freedom begins when you stop rehearsing who you were and start standing in who God declared you to be. Chains fall when identity is accepted, not debated. When you rise knowing who you are in God, what once bound you becomes evidence of what no longer controls you. Number 7. You were built for this life, not a smaller one. God does not make mistakes with timing, placement, or design. You were not born into the wrong generation, raised in the wrong environment, or shaped by the wrong experiences. Every detail of your life has been allowed, directed, or redeemed by God to prepare you for the assignment He placed within you. Rising is not ambition when it flows from alignment. It is simply stepping into what God already determined. The Bible is filled with people who were positioned precisely where they needed to be, even when it felt inconvenient or overwhelming. Esther did not choose her moment, yet Scripture declares she was placed there for such a time as this. Paul did not plan his conversion, yet his background, education, and trials uniquely equipped him to reach both Jews and Gentiles. The early church did not seek persecution, but it became the catalyst for expansion. God consistently uses circumstances that feel limiting to launch purpose that feels impossible. You were built to carry what you are stepping into. The pressure you face now is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence of capacity. God does not assign weight without first shaping strength. What feels heavy is often confirmation that your calling requires depth, discernment, and endurance. You are not being overwhelmed. You are being trusted. Rising into this life means releasing the belief that you must earn your place or prove your worth. God's calling is not a reward for perfection. It is an invitation to obedience. You rise not because you are flawless, but because God is faithful. When you walk in alignment with Him, your life begins to make sense, even when it challenges others' expectations. You were not built to blend in, to remain silent, or to live restrained by fear of misunderstanding. You were built to reflect God's purpose in a world that desperately needs clarity, courage, and truth. Rising is not rebellion, it is response. With conclusion, there is a point where hesitation becomes disobedience, and shrinking becomes resistance to God's work in your life. This is the moment many people sense but struggle to name. The moment when God calls you to stand fully in who He created you to be. Not louder, not harder, but truer. You do not need permission to obey God. You do not need approval to rise. The same God who formed you knew the resistance you would face and still called you forward. He is not surprised by the cost, and He is not intimidated by the pressure. What He begins, He sustains. Release the guilt you've carried for outgrowing old versions of yourself. Let go of the fear of being misunderstood. Stop apologizing for obedience. Humility is not denying who God made you. It is honoring Him by walking in it faithfully. If God built you for this life, then He also equipped you to live it. Rise with clarity. Rise with courage. Rise with trust. And know this, when you stand in alignment with God's purpose, you are never standing alone.